In today's episode, we're discussing diversity in the legal industry with special guests Brandi Miller and Al Johnson. Welcome to the Law Firm Launch Podcast.
Welcome, everyone, to the Law Firm Launch Podcast, LLP. I have really enjoyed us launching this podcast. I mean, just talking to people within our industry and hearing different perspectives from lawyers on how they've grown their firms and how they're growing their firm, dealing with societal challenges. It's been really enlightening. And I think what I've sort of gotten out of this is that so many lawyers are wanting to just have this conversation and hear from other lawyers that are going through something similar. And there's just so much beauty even in that, being able to connect with other people that are in a similar environment professionally, but clearly in a similar environment socially. And so we've been in this diversity series for the last few weeks, and really under the context of we need to do better. We need to do better in our industry. And we thought, what better concept than to try to hear from lawyers about their experiences within racial equality, within our industry, racial inequality, and diversity in general too, because certainly being a person of color and then also being a female person of color, Brandi, comes with its own set of unique challenges. And I'm just so happy to have you, Brandi Miller and Al Johnson, and hearing the work that you all have been doing within this space too is just incredibly inspiring. So thank you so much for being with us today. And let's jump in with each of you just taking a minute or two just to say who you are and sort of your role within the industry, and some things you've been touching within the diversity space. Brandi, you want to start?
Sure. So I run my own firm, and I also work for New Covenant Legal Services, doing work for the poor, for incarcerated, underprivileged, people that really need help and typically don't have access to legal services. I also work for the Juvenile Court of St. Louis County, where I represent children and or parents who are dealing with the system. And I've been doing this type of work for a while now. Al is actually my mentor. He's the one that got me started into it. And I started with this, actually the same reason I'm still in it, which is wanting to help people. And seeing that depending on where you grew up, your education level, sometimes your race, your identity, that might determine whether or not you have access to real help, whether or not, what your outcome is. And I wanted to be someone that fought for justice for all. And so that's kind of how I got into it and why I'm here.
That's awesome. Al, why don't you give us a quick minute or two?
Yeah, I'll try to compress it. The older you get, the harder it is to compress things, but I'll keep it real brief. I've been a practicing attorney for 39 years now, and I spent probably most of those years in private practice. I had a brief stint with the St. Louis County Prosecutor's Office, but then for the better part of 25 years, I was in the private practice of law, and I specialized in commercial litigation, some civil rights. Along the way, I always tried to help out some people pro bono or on a very low-cost basis, but the realities of private practice today really don't allow you to do as much of that as many of us would like to. So in 2013, I started, along with some of my church leaders, New Covenant Legal Services, and we provide a low cost and some pro bono. We have something called low bono, where we charge people a little bit something for the services, but not much. And because we're privately financed, we can do that. We're not under any restraints to only take certain people or only take people that are within 125% of poverty guidelines. So I went full time with that in 2017. And we're now in our seventh year, and we've got a very active caseload, and we do a lot of work in St. Louis City. We represent kind of people who are poor, people who are on fixed incomes, and a lot of working poor, people that have jobs and are trying, but simply can't overcome many times their own lack of financial resources
Yeah.
and tend to get taken advantage of
Yeah.
by credit card companies and payday loan companies and unscrupulous landlords and used car dealers.
Yeah.
And so we have a pretty active caseload and no lack of work. And I feel as a Christian, this is really what God would have had me to do my whole career. And if I could have afforded to do it, I would have done it. But now at my age and on Social Security, I can afford to kind of take a small salary and really do this full time. And it's really been a great blessing.
That's awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much. And I'm glad to have you both on this call for two reasons. Well, probably more than two. But we'll end our call talking a little bit about the award that just happened. We'll save that for the big finale here because I think it's indicative of the work that you all have been doing. But, not only do I respect you both in the work that you're doing today, but the dichotomy of you doing it together. And, just to call a spade, Al, you are a white man, right?
Really?
And Brandi is a woman of color.
Really?
And so, yeah. But I think it's just, I was so glad to be able to have this conversation with the two of you and the mentoring relationship that you've had and what you've been able to accomplish together and the work that you're doing together, I think is very powerful. And so I'm just saying that out of the gate because some people will be like, why do you got this white man on this diversity series? Like what value is that going to add? And so I'm excited to have this conversation because I think that so much is going to come out of this in inspiring lawyers to think differently, to behave hopefully differently, and in just our industry as a whole to be able to elevate and make some pretty significant changes. And I think we have the abilities to do that through everyone bringing our collective voice together and offering some suggestions and ideas. So why don't we kick off with telling me about, your interactions with and or experiences through the lens of racial diversity and equality in our industry. And I want you and really think about that from your perspective, because I think that dichotomy of hearing Al's perspective and hearing yours, Brandi, is going to, help bring some enlightenment to other people and their experiences as well. So let's start with you again, Brandi, and then we'll move to Al.
So I've seen a lot of things that point to the differences based on many things, race, typically poverty levels. A great example would be when you show up to court, how a person dresses. Oftentimes, judges and other attorneys judge people by how they dress. When I show up for something, I try to dress in a suit or something nice so that I'm perceived as being respectful to the court. And oftentimes, if someone shows up in less than ideal wear, people feel that they're disrespecting the court process, not realizing that these people may not have access to clothing that we would consider quote unquote appropriate. Sure, and so something so small that you don't really think about. And I remember having a conversation with a client, hey, when you get ready to show up for court, this is what I want you to wear. And having that conversation about, well, Ms. Miller, where do I get that from? And me saying, well, why don't, you go to Goodwill? You can get some decent clothes from Goodwill. And the client reminded me they didn't have a car. They didn't have a way to get there. The money they would have to spend to just catch the bus to get there would have created a hardship for them. And so that got me to thinking about how many of us take for granted every day the simple things, right? You get up, you get dressed, you may drive to work. Some people don't have that luxury. Showing up to court for me is easy. Showing up to court for my clients may require a 2 to 3 hour bus tour to get there. And so it makes a difference. Having to take off work for court is a huge effect. That can affect the family significantly. I know clients that have been fired for going to court, even though they had a note saying they had to be there, things of that nature. So the access to the justice system is not fair for everyone. And I think something really important is not only being cognizant and aware of it, but then trying to balance that out by for example, now we have a lot of Zoom hearings, and Al may tell you he doesn't like them as much. But I do think it gives certain people access to the court system that didn't have it before, because where they would be there for hours, maybe waiting on their court case to be called. Now they can log on, and when their case is called, it's 15 or 20-minute ordeal versus hours and hours. So there are many different avenues where people are not able to have this access. And I think that just being aware of it and trying to combat that is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. Yeah, I appreciate how your perspective and what you were sharing in your experiences is probably goes just a lot to your character and like how you look at life. It's all about how racial inequality is affecting others, right? Certainly you've had your own, I'm sure, moments and experiences, but I love that because, being focused on other people and how we can impact, our industry is huge, right? Being able to step in as truly that advocate. Al, how about you? What experiences would you share just through the lens of racial diversity through your career?
Yeah, well, and first of all, I approach the process of racial diversity and reconciliation, which is really the place that God has put me. I approach it with great humility because as a young man, I had a lot of pretty bad racial attitudes. And Brandi wouldn't have liked being around me when I was 16 years old, which was how old she was when I first met her. Um, God really changed that when I really submitted my life to Christ. God took that away from me, and God has a sense of humor because He takes people sometimes that have been part of the problem and makes them part of the solution. And that's what He did with me. He gave me a real heart to try to repair some of the damage that I and others like me had done, and also to bring about some reconciliation. And that's taken a lot of forms over the years. I worked at a youth ministry in North St. Louis when I first came here to St. Louis and before I went to law school. And over the years, I've been involved in diverse churches. I've had an African American pastor. I've done a lot of work on in the area of diversity and inclusion. And at New Covenant Legal Services, we do it by taking a substantial number of our clientele are African American. And necessarily by design, it's because they're the people that don't have always access to the legal resources they need. We can say equal justice under the law, and that's kind of a nice sounding cliche, but it's not a reality unless everyone has access to quality legal services at a price they can afford. And along with Legal Service of Eastern Missouri and Arch City Defenders and a lot of other groups that have really sprung up here in St. Louis in the last 5 or 10 years, we're helping fill that void and really working for diversity and inclusion. I don't know why God raised up a white guy in his late 60s to be the leader of that. Part of it is that a lot of our African Americans don't have financial resources or the connections to kickstart things, or don't have maybe the same access to, justice system resources. Look at the Jackie Robinson story. Robinson is obviously a charismatic, courageous figure, but he never would have gotten to first base, literally, as well as figuratively, if he didn't have Branch Rickey. So I don't want to flatter myself by comparing myself to Branch Rickey because he was a great man, but I think that's a story about how, a Caucasian who's been around the block a few times and had his own issues and back and forth with racism, it can be a Kickstarter for something like this. And obviously, 5 years from now, I'd like to see myself in the background. Hopefully, I'll be fully retired by that age. But we'd like to see another African American like Brandi or someone else actually leading this effort. And we've tried to fill that void in the meantime by getting a lot of African Americans involved as attorneys, volunteer attorneys, and actual, of course, hiring a Brandi, interns, and law clerks. And, we've tried to make sure that we've got as diverse a staff as possibly can.
Well,
And can I add something? Oh, sorry.
yeah,
Go ahead.
please, no, go ahead, jump
I
in,
just
Brandi.
wanted to add to that, part of equality and diversity is bringing everybody to the table, not just one. And so I think that that's part of the reason why Al is so important to this struggle, because you can't just have one face, one voice. You have to have everybody, all these different perspectives that come together in a melting pot and help us see it from all different angles. And that's the only way that you can fix these problems in the system, is by bringing everybody together and having everybody on board with the same common goal.
Yeah. No, I love that. And it's similar to what I was going to call out, is that I think the key, people, the common phrase of like, the very first step is just acceptance and like acknowledgement, right? And I love that Al offers that. Like, if we're going to change the industry, it starts with changing ourselves. And how we change ourselves is by acknowledging that we have that bias, right? Or acknowledging that we've probably not behaved in the best ways, or maybe we just haven't stuck up for people of color in the way that we should, right? In a social or professional situation, out of fear or not having confidence or whatever it is, right? But I love that Al, went down that road of humility and saying like, okay, number one is I have to acknowledge, right? I have acknowledge where I've come from, acknowledge my bias, acknowledge my privilege that I've experienced, so that I can really start to hear what others are saying and the perspectives that they're coming from. Or even like seeing the industry in a different light, seeing the court system in a way that maybe you haven't seen it before because you've changed your lens, right? So I love that, because that's probably the first step for a lot of people, is saying, okay, how can I at least acknowledge where I'm at, my mindset, and then be really open to hearing, how I can change. On that note, if you were gonna say what you would like to see from law firms, like how could law firms, or what should they be doing over the next couple of years to really be a part of these discussions in a positive way to affect change? Are there some practical pieces of advice or words of wisdom that you would give to law firm owners to say, how can they play a role in truly changing our industry for the better?
Well, I can take a
Where's Al?
swing at that one if you want me to,
Yeah.
Jaimee, first. Well, there's a lot of ways, but probably the biggest way is the power to hire. And you can mentor a lot of young African Americans, women, people of color, um, by simply hiring them as law clerks, getting them on as interns, and eventually trying to get as many lawyers as you can. I don't think just getting black faces in your firm is the goal. It's got to be the right person, and it's got to be a good fit. But so many young people that are going to law school today haven't had mentors. I grew up in a strong home with a father and mother. Not every kid does that. A lot of people grow up in single family homes now. And of course, I needed some mentors because neither of my parents ever completed college. I was the first person in my family to complete college, and first person and the only person ever to go to graduate school. So we all need those mentors, and many times a lot of our African Americans haven't had as much access to mentoring as one would like. So I think that's one way, is really expand programs so they can get into the legal system, build their confidence, make them feel that for those that aren't in law school, make them feel they can go to law school and succeed, and try to make the way as easy as possible.
Yeah, that's great. Do you want to add anything else, Brandi?
Just a little bit. I wouldn't have even gone to law school had it not been for Al. I didn't know any attorneys. The few I had seen from a distance didn't remind me of me at all. I was the first college graduate in my family, so nobody was expecting me to necessarily be a lawyer. And he was the one that looked at me and saw potential and said, hey, you could be anything. So I think that that's, what's so important, like he said, because mentoring and talking to people and encouraging them, and then do some training, have equity, seminars and workshops, have bias training, those types of things to help you better yourself so that you can see where your weaknesses are and address them. because we all have them. Weaknesses are part of what makes us human, right? And so being able to do that is what I think will make the difference.
That's awesome.
And if I can add just one quick thing to that, I'm not against bias training. I think it's necessary, but a lot of times people need a heart change, and you can give people all the training in the world, and it doesn't always happen. But really, the next best thing is being put in a position where they're actually working with African Americans or people of color or minorities, and having the opportunity to walk in their shoes a little bit. If you have a casual conversation once a week with somebody, that's one thing. Or maybe live in the same neighborhood with them, but really getting down and spending time with them and hearing their life experiences really makes you a lot more sensitive. And I think it's the most positive form of bias training. So that interaction and that working together is critically important. I know my heart started to change when in college for the first time, I became a friend with an African American who was on the track team with me at the a college I went to where I ran track, and I'd never had an African American teammate before. And he was a wonderful guy who kind of overlooked some of my immaturity and some of my racial issues and really kind of befriended me. And that made a huge difference. That started to change my whole perception. If all you know about one group of people is what you see in the 10 o'clock news every night, it's going to be a pretty distorted view.
That's so fair. And I love that you both kind of added something of value because, you can offer training, but if your firm is full of a bunch of, white people, right? If there's no diversity in your firm, what that bias training will do is it'll just check a box to make us feel better about ourselves, right? That we somehow played a role. Until we actually start intentionally having a strategy of diversity and hiring minorities and hiring people of color, and until we start intentionally doing that and having a plan in place to try to diversify our firm, the training is never really going to accomplish much. But it's the training combined with, right, those practical strategies of getting those interactions happening that really starts to create some more power. So let's do this. Let's end on this last question here of, if you were going to give, Al, you were speaking to, advice, or you're speaking of your own experience and sort of recognizing maybe some bad behaviors that you had or bad mindset around people of color. And then since you sort of putting those strategies in place of hiring and mentoring and supporting, a different culture of your own to try to impact change. And then, Brandi, you being a woman of color in this industry, if you could give your best advice for lawyers, both, I would say maybe, Al, your perspective is, lawyers that are experiencing inequality within their firm, how would you advise people of color, like from you being in the position that you were at? And then, Brandi, from your perspective, how would you advise lawyers that are experiencing some of that inequality in their own firms, right? Or maybe not, inequality is one word, but it could be tension, it could be dissonance, like whatever words you want to use, right? The yucky stuff, the icky stuff. How would you give your best piece of advice based on your experience and where you've come from on how they, from their position of being a person of color, can help impact change for the positive, for themselves and for their firm?
You want to go first, Al?
Right. Well, Martin Luther King provides a pretty prolific example for all of us because even though he spoke strongly and courageously to presidents, to sheriffs, to anyone that he encountered, he did it with an attitude of, I want to persuade you to change your heart. And that's really what he desired. I don't think that 90%, maybe even 95% of those people in this country really have any kind of personal animosity towards racial minorities. I really don't. I think there's a lot of ignorance and insensitivity out there. So what I would say to a young person of color who's in, say, a law firm and feels like they're maybe being treated differently is recognize, one, it may not be happening the way you're perceiving it. And two, that even if it is, it's probably not being done deliberately. So I think the Bible's got some great principles of how to deal with things like that. And then as you go directly to the person that you feel offended by or marginalized by, and you just explain it to them very calmly. George or Al, this is how I'm feeling. And you've said some things and done some things that I maybe I'm taking it the wrong way, but it sounds a little bit like you perhaps aren't respecting me. And, I've had people do that to me a couple times. I've had the experience in the workplace of having to do that once or twice to a boss. And boy, oh boy, 95% of the time it has remarkable results. It really does work when people are approached, and it starts to change them. A lot of times you'll hear some things back from them that may help you to understand that you're really not being treated differently. And that's just the way maybe they treat everybody. But it really helps both people to get a perspective. And those are the kind of things that have gone on. I've had a number of my African American friends, Brandi, frankly, being one of them, who I've been able to use as a sounding board over the years. And I'll ask them every once in a while, listen, was I a little too strong on that? Or, did I do this? Did I do that? So those are the kind of relationships that need to be cultivated over time. And I think that's the power that a young person in maybe a predominantly white law firm has to really affect change at an individual level.
I like that. It's the have enough confidence to have a respectful conversation around how you feel, going into it with an open mind and doing it afraid, right? Instead of suffering in silence, which is I think what a lot of people end up doing. Instead of speaking up, they kind of suffer in silence or even grow in the feeling and the animosity from talking to others and when you're talking about it to someone else and not to the person, you're not finding any solution there, right? It probably just grows and gets to bigger and becomes a bigger issue. So I like that advice, do it afraid, have confidence, and approach that conversation respectfully about how you feel. And you never know. If you go in with an open mind, you could get a better result than you were expecting. How about you, Brandi? What would you share?
So I agree with Al. The only thing I would change about that is, as someone that has gone through that in certain environments, I think you have to call people out, but with love. Al will tell you I have no problem sharing my opinion. I'm pretty strong-willed, but part of that is because I had a great family support system too, who said, "Hey, I'll be behind you no matter what." And those fights started early when I was in grade school, getting grades that I didn't agree with, having to fight about that. Having teachers that said, "Hey, you're aiming too high when you're talking about being a pharmacist or a doctor," and my mother having to show up to the school and say, "No, she's not." Things like that. But what I would also say is, remember to care about people first. We are all lost, and if you do not care about someone, then you're not in a position to teach them or coach them to be better, because it has to start with, "Hey, I care about you, and let me tell you what I see." But why should they listen to someone who doesn't care about them?
Yeah.
And I think that is the one thing that we're sometimes missing. We're caught in our own emotions. I've definitely gotten upset, felt mistreated, things of that nature. But being able to say, you know what is going on with that person that made them that way? Maybe they had a bad day that day. Maybe it wasn't directed at me at all. It just ended up landing on me, right? And so being able to do that and be positive, and kind of like Al said about the guy that he met who really changed his perspective, being that beacon of light for people so that I don't fit into that stereotype for them. They can't just ignore me. They can't just put me into that box or that category. They're going to have to face this reality. So.
Yeah. That's great. Thank you both so much. This has been awesome. I really appreciate, just several of the things that you said, but at the heart, I think, or the theme rather, this entire call has been that every person matters. That's what I'm hearing, right? When I'm hearing both of you speak, it's every person matters, regardless of their background or culture or gender or belief system. Like, they matter. And when we start approaching others with that top of mind, that every person matters, it will change how we treat those around us and how we see those around us and how they're treating us. And so I just appreciate, both the things that both of you have shared. And I'd like to end with you just telling us real quickly about the award, Al, that you got recently, and the work, Brandi was involved in and with your firm. Tell us real quickly about that. I think it's pretty cool.
Well, a friend of mine, Pete Woods, nominated me for the award, and I accepted it, and I was glad I did, because it really gave me a chance to talk about it from the perspective of an old white guy who has had some experience over the years of at least attempting to mentor, racial minorities, and particularly African Americans, because I think they're the ones that have probably gotten the brunt of, one national commentator would say, some of us have gotten the New Deal, some of us have gotten the Raw Deal. And I think African Americans culturally and socially and politically have probably gotten more than their share of the Raw Deal over the years. So that's the place I've gone. And I think we need both types of people. I was surprised that so many of the recipients were Caucasians, but in a sense, it takes racially sensitive Caucasians to really start to change the culture, because they're typically the ones that have the access to the resources to do it and the contacts to do it. And I think we need both Caucasians and African Americans pulling together to really see a major change. So I was happy to be part of that, and give me a chance to give my testimony a little bit. And,
tell us the name of the tell everyone the name of the award real quick.
I think it was called the plaques outside. I think it was called it was Missouri Lawyers Media Diversity and Inclusion Award is I think what it was. Yeah. Brandi can correct me if I'm wrong, but that's what I believe it was. So
that's awesome. Well, and I love ending on that note too of Al, you saying, white people playing a role in being sensitive to what's going on within our society racially, in using that accepted bias and privilege to actually perpetuate positive change, right, within the Black community, and others, obviously. But it's how can we completely flip that, right? It's not just saying acknowledgement is the first step to recovery, right? And then the second step is now how can we actually start using that knowledge of our access to resources and our privilege to actually do some good and perpetuate this change where maybe we're not having this conversation anymore 10 years from now or 20 years from now. So again, thank you both so much, Brandi Miller, Al Johnson, for being on the podcast today. It's been lovely. I truly appreciate you as humans and what you offered to us and our listeners today. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having
us. Thank you, Jaimee. We really appreciate that opportunity.
Bye.
Thanks for tuning in today. Be sure to hit subscribe or go to legalbackoffice.com for more info.